My name is Claire Dune, and I was 31 years old the morning a courier handed me an envelope that told me I no longer owned half of the bakery I grew up in. I want you to picture the letter. Cream paper, a law firm's letterhead, my name spelled correctly at the top, which almost made it worse. Somewhere between the second and third paragraph, I read the sentence that stopped my coffee halfway to my mouth. Effective as of the enclosed transfer deed, all ownership interest previously held by Claire Dune in Sweetwater Bakery has been conveyed to Renee Dune. My signature was on that deed. Notarized. Dated 11 months earlier. I had never signed it. I had never even seen it. I want to be honest about something before I go further. I didn't cry when I read that letter. I sat very still at my kitchen counter with my own catering business's invoices spread out in front of me, half a cup of coffee going cold by my elbow, and I felt something colder than tears. I felt the particular stillness you get right before you decide to stop being surprised by your own family. I read the letter 3 times. Then I set it down, squared the edges with my palm the way my mother used to square a stack of order tickets, and I sat there for a long time listening to the refrigerator hum. I remember thinking, very clearly, that whatever came next, I was not going to be the person who screamed into a phone. I was going to be the person who read every page. Before I tell you what I did next, tell me where you're watching this from and what time it is where you are. I always like knowing that. Now let me take you back to the beginning, because you need to understand the bakery before you can understand what my sister thought she was getting away with. Sweetwater Bakery sat on the corner of Ashford and 3rd in a town called Millbrook, the kind of small town where everyone still calls it the corner store, even though it's been a chain pharmacy since 2004. My grandfather built the bakery with his own hands in 1968. My mother, Joanne Dune, took it over in her 20s and ran it for the next 4 decades, 6 days a week, closed only on Christmas and the day my father's funeral was held. I grew up behind that counter. I learned to read a recipe before I learned to read a chapter book. I remember standing on an overturned milk crate at 6 years old so I could reach the mixing bowl, my mother's hand over mine guiding the wooden spoon, the smell of cinnamon and yeast so constant in my childhood that even now, 30 years later, it's the smell I associate with the word safe. My mother used to say the bakery had 2 kinds of flour on the shelf, the kind you bake with and the kind of family you can trust, and she never once let anyone forget which kind she thought I was. She kept a photograph taped inside the register drawer for as long as I can remember, my grandfather standing in front of the newly painted Sweetwater sign in 1968, flour still dusted on his forearms, grinning like a man who'd just built something that would outlast him. Every time she opened that drawer to make change, I'd catch a glimpse of it. And some part of me understood, even as a child, that the bakery wasn't just a business to her. It was the one thing in the world she trusted absolutely to still be standing after she wasn't. My sister Renee is 4 years older than me. Where I was quiet and careful, Renee was loud and certain, the kind of certain that makes people mistake confidence for competence. She never much cared for the bakery growing up. She used to complain about the smell of yeast getting into her hair before dates. She left for business school at 20 and came back at 26 with a marketing degree and a habit of describing herself as an entrepreneur to anyone who would listen, though I never once saw her run anything longer than 8 months. There was a boutique candle company, then a line of protein cookies she tried to sell out of the trunk of her car, then a short-lived stint reselling handbags online that ended with 3 angry customers and a chargeback dispute my mother quietly paid off so it wouldn't follow Renee's name around town. Each time, Renee framed the failure as bad timing, bad partners, bad luck, never anything closer to home than that. My mother always found a way to help her land softly. I don't say that with bitterness anymore, not really. I say it because it matters for what came later. Renee had spent her whole adult life being caught by someone before she hit the ground. And I think somewhere along the way, she stopped believing the ground was something she needed to worry about at all. I was the opposite kind of daughter, the kind nobody worries about, which sounds like a compliment until you've lived inside it for 30 years. Nobody ever asked if I needed help because I never let it show that I did. I paid my own way through community college working the bakery counter on weekends. I never once asked my mother to cover a bounced check or bail me out of a bad decision, and somewhere in there, without anyone quite deciding it on purpose, I became the daughter who was simply expected to be fine. I was the one who stayed. I did the early mornings, the 4 a.m. dough, the ovens that never quite ran, even no matter how many times we called the repairman. I learned the wholesale accounts, the tax filings, the way my mother liked her ledgers color-coded in a system only the two of us understood. By the time I was 25, I effectively ran the place, though my mother's name was still the only one on the original deed. When I turned 28, I did something that still causes an ache behind my ribs when I think about it too long. I left. Not out of anger, not exactly. I left because I had built something inside those four walls that nobody in my family seemed able to see, and I wanted, just once, to build something people would have to notice. I remember the conversation with my mother the night I told her. We were closing up, wiping down the display case, the smell of the last batch of rolls still warm in the air. I told her I wanted to start my own catering business, weddings and corporate events, the kind of work the bakery never had the staff or the hours to take on. I was terrified she'd take it as a rejection of everything she'd built. Instead, she wiped her hands on her apron, looked at me for a long moment, and said, "Good. You should have something with your own name on it before you're 40. I waited too long to say that to myself. That was the whole conversation. That was my mother in a single sentence, careful with money and generous with the things that actually mattered. I started Dune & Co. out of a rented commercial kitchen 2 towns over, working nights and weekends at first, still doing the bakery's books from my laptop at midnight because nobody else in the family knew how to reconcile a ledger. I told my mother I would still help. I told Renee nothing, because by then Renee and I had stopped being the kind of sisters who told each other things. We still saw each other at holidays, still texted on birthdays, but the closeness we'd had as children, the kind where you know exactly what the other person is thinking before they say it, had worn away slowly over the years, the way a countertop wears smooth from use, until one day you notice the finish is gone and you can't remember exactly when it happened. My mother's memory started slipping the year I turned 29. It began small, the way these things do. She forgot the name of a regular customer she'd known for 15 years. She left the display case unlocked overnight, twice. She called me Renee once, on the phone, and corrected herself so fast I almost convinced myself I'd imagined it. But I hadn't imagined it, and by the time she was formally diagnosed with early-stage dementia that winter, some quiet part of me had already been bracing for it for months. Here's what you need to understand about my mother before I go any further. She was sharp even as she was slipping. Sharp enough to be frightened of her own forgetting. Sharp enough to know exactly what kind of daughter Renee had become, and exactly what kind of daughter I still was. Renee moved back into my mother's house 6 weeks after the diagnosis. I want to give her the benefit of the doubt here, because for a while I did. I told myself she was stepping up. She started managing my mother's calendar, her medications, her appointments. She started talking about power of attorney, which made sense on paper. Someone needed legal authority to handle my mother's affairs as the disease progressed, and Renee, living in the house, seemed like the obvious choice. I want you to notice something, because I didn't notice it fast enough myself. The paperwork for that power of attorney was drawn up by a lawyer Renee found on her own, a man named Foster Kellerman whose office was 40 minutes outside town, not our family's longtime attorney, a woman named Diane Whitcomb who had handled the bakery's affairs since before I was born. When I asked Renee why we weren't using Diane, she said Diane was retiring and Foster had better rates. I believed her, because at the time I had no reason not to. The power of attorney was signed on a Tuesday in March at the kitchen table in my mother's house. I wasn't there. Renee told me it was a quick, simple appointment, and there was no need for both of us to take time off work. I remember feeling a small flicker of unease and swallowing it, because that had always been my role in this family, the one who swallowed things. For the first several months, nothing seemed wrong. Renee handled my mother's bills. She drove her to appointments. She posted cheerful updates in the family group chat about how well Mom was doing, photos of the two of them baking together, captions like "blessed to have this time with her." I liked those photos. I want to be honest about that too. Some small, hopeful part of me was glad Renee had finally found a way to be useful to our mother. Glad that maybe this illness had somehow made my sister into a better person. I kept doing the bakery's books remotely, the way I always had, because my mother had asked me to before her diagnosis worsened, and because, frankly, nobody else in the family knew how. I noticed small discrepancies that spring. A vendor payment that seemed higher than usual. A withdrawal marked miscellaneous, then another one 3 weeks later, then another. Individually, they looked like nothing. The kind of thing you'd wave off as a bookkeeping error, $40 here, $90 there. A supply order that didn't quite match the invoice. I mentioned it once to my business partner at Dune & Co., a woman named Priya who handled our own accounts and had a nose for numbers that didn't add up. She looked over my shoulder at the spreadsheet one night while we were closing out a wedding invoice and went quiet in a way I didn't like. "Claire," she said, "these miscellaneous entries are all on Tuesdays. Every single one." I remember laughing it off at the time, telling her it was probably just the day Renee did the bakery's errands. I didn't want it to mean anything else. I asked Renee about it anyway, in a text message, casual, almost apologetic for even bringing it up. She said she'd look into it. She never did, and I let it go, because I was drowning in my own business that spring. 3 weddings booked in the same month, linen orders and cake tastings and a walk-in cooler that kept failing at the worst possible times, and because some part of me still didn't want to believe what the numbers were quietly telling me. It is a strange thing, choosing not to look closely at something because you are afraid of what looking closely will cost you. The call that changed everything came on a Thursday afternoon in October, almost exactly 11 months after that quiet Tuesday signing at my mother's kitchen table. It wasn't Renee who called. It was a real estate agent named Marissa Voss, and she was polite and businesslike in a way that made my stomach drop before she'd even finished her first sentence. "Hi, is this Claire Dune?" she asked. "I'm calling to confirm a walk-through time for the Ashford Street property. Your sister mentioned you might want to be present for the final inspection before closing." I asked her, very carefully, what closing she meant. "The sale of the bakery," she said, sounding confused now herself. "It's scheduled to close in 3 weeks. I have the paperwork right here. Both owners of record signed off back in November of last year. Renee Dune and Claire Dune." I sat down on the floor of my own kitchen. I remember the cold of the tile through my jeans, the hum of my refrigerator, the sound of a car passing outside my window like the world had simply kept going without checking whether it should. I told Marissa there had been some kind of mistake, that I was an owner and I had never signed anything, and she went quiet in the way people go quiet when they realize they've stepped into the middle of something they weren't supposed to see. "I'm so sorry," she said. "I assumed it had all been handled on your end. Your sister has been the one coordinating everything." She read me the buyer's name, a regional developer called Marchford Holdings, and the sale price, a number that made my chest tighten because it was low. Low enough that I understood immediately this wasn't a careful sale. It was a fire sale, the kind of price you take when you want something gone fast and you don't especially care what it's worth. I thanked Marissa for calling, hung up, and sat on that cold tile floor for a long time before I trusted myself to stand up and dial the next number. That night I called Diane Whitcomb, our old family attorney, the one Renee had quietly stopped using. Diane still had the original bakery deed from 1968 in her files, still had the amendment my mother had filed years earlier adding both Renee and me as co-owners after our father died, a fact Renee had apparently either forgotten I knew or hoped I never would. Diane pulled the file while I was still on the phone with her. I heard papers shuffling. Then I heard her go very quiet. "Claire," she said, "I need you to come into my office tomorrow morning. And I need you to bring every bank statement, every piece of mail, everything related to the bakery you've gotten in the last 18 months. Don't tell your sister you're coming. I didn't sleep that night. I sat at my kitchen table with a legal pad, and I did what I have always done when my family gives me no other choice." I started making a list. Diane's office smelled like old paper and peppermint candy, same as it had since I was a child sitting in the waiting room while my mother handled the bakery's taxes. There was a dish of the same butterscotch candies on her desk that had been there 20 years earlier, and I found myself staring at it while I waited for her to finish pulling files, the small, absurd comfort of a thing that hadn't changed while everything else had. Diane came in carrying a thick folder and closed the door behind her, which she never used to do. "Sit," she said, not unkindly. "I've spent most of the night going through this, and I want to walk you through it slowly so nothing gets lost." She laid 3 documents side by side on her desk the next morning, the way you'd lay out evidence, because that is exactly what they were. The first was the 1968 deed. My grandfather's original signature faded to the color of weak tea. The second was the amendment from 6 years ago, naming Joanne, Renee, and Claire Dune as joint owners of the property and the business, notarized properly, witnessed by 2 people I recognized, Diane's longtime paralegal and a woman from the bank next door. The third was the transfer deed from 11 months ago, the one that had arrived in my mailbox as a fait accompli. Diane turned it toward me and pointed to the signature on the line marked Claire Dune. "Is that your signature?" she asked. I looked at it for a long time. It was close. Close enough that a busy clerk at a title company would never have questioned it. But it wasn't mine. My C has a small hook at the top that I've written the same way since I was 9 years old, copying my mother's handwriting off grocery lists. This C didn't have the hook. "No," I said. "That's not my signature." Diane nodded slowly, like she'd expected that answer and had been dreading it anyway. Then she asked me the question that would end up mattering more than almost anything else in this entire story. "Did your mother ever mention setting anything up before her diagnosis got worse? A trust, a separate filing, anything at all?" I told her I didn't know of anything, and I meant it. But something in the back of my mind snagged on the question, the way a splinter snags on wool. My mother had gone quiet for 2 weeks that spring, right around the time Renee moved in, right around the time of that Tuesday signing I hadn't been invited to. She'd told me she was busy handling some paperwork Renee had helped her set up. At the time, I'd assumed she meant medical directives. I had never once thought to ask further. I want to pause here and tell you something, because I think some of you watching this already know exactly what I'm about to say. Sometimes the people who love us best protect us in ways we don't discover until much later, and sometimes those people are quietly, deliberately, one step ahead of the very family members trying to take advantage of them. Diane told me to sit tight while she pulled the county recorder's full file on the Ashford Street property, not just the deed pages Renee's lawyer had used, but everything on record. It took 3 days. When Diane called me back, her voice had a note in it I hadn't heard from her before. Not alarm exactly, something closer to quiet astonishment. "Claire," she said, "I need you to come back in. Your mother did something I don't think your sister knows about. Here is what Diane found, and I'm going to walk you through it the way she walked me through it, because it took me a long time to understand it myself. 14 months before that forged transfer deed, 2 months before Renee moved back into the house, 1 month before my mother's official diagnosis, my mother had quietly gone to see Diane alone. Not Renee's lawyer, Foster Kellerman. Diane, the woman who had handled our family's affairs for 40 years, the woman my mother trusted the way she trusted almost no one else on earth. My mother told Diane she'd been having trouble with names and numbers. She hadn't told anyone else yet, not even me. She said she was frightened of what might happen to the bakery if her memory got worse, frightened specifically, in Diane's careful legal language, of undue influence from someone close to her. She didn't name Renee outright. She didn't have to. My mother asked Diane to draft an irrevocable trust, the Joanne Dune Family Property Trust, and to transfer the actual real estate underneath Sweetwater Bakery, the land and the building itself, into that trust. Not the business operations, not the recipes or the equipment or the day-to-day accounts, just the property, the one asset that could never be replaced if it were sold out from under the family. She named herself as trustee while she still had capacity. She named me, Claire Dune, as successor trustee, the person who would take over control the moment she was formally declared unable to manage her own affairs. She asked me one question before she signed anything. Diane told me, tapping the folder. She asked me, if something happens to my mind before it happens to my body, is there a way to make sure the building can't just walk out the front door with somebody's signature on a piece of paper? I told her yes, there was, and she said, then that's what I want, and I don't want either of my daughters to know until it matters. I asked her if she was sure she didn't want to at least tell you, since you were the one still working the books. She said, if I tell Claire, Claire will worry, and if I tell Renee, Renee will find a way around it. So I'm not telling anyone. Just do the paperwork, Diane, and keep it in the file until somebody needs it. Diane looked at me over her glasses. I have never, in 40 years of practicing law, had a client plan for her own decline with that much clarity. I want you to understand that about your mother before we go any further. The trust was signed, witnessed, and recorded at the county clerk's office 14 months before Renee ever forged a single signature. My mother had done this alone, quietly, telling no one, not even me, because she said, according to Diane's notes from that meeting, that she didn't want to hurt anyone by accusing them of something before it happened. She just wanted to make sure that if it did happen, it wouldn't work. I sat in Diane's office and read my mother's own handwritten note, tucked into the file, the way you'd tuck a letter into a book you knew someone would eventually open. It said only this: Claire, if you're reading this, I'm sorry it had to come to this. Protect the building. The rest can be rebuilt. I love you both, but I trust you. I'm not going to pretend I didn't cry reading that. I did, right there in Diane's office, the same office that had smelled like peppermint candy since I was a child. Here's what that trust meant in practical terms, and I want to explain it clearly because it's the entire hinge this story turns on. Renee's forged transfer deed had conveyed my supposed ownership interest in the bakery to herself, and then Renee had gone on to sign a sale agreement with a developer who wanted to knock down the building and put in a chain coffee shop. But Renee's deed, forged or not, only ever covered the business entity, the LLC that ran day-to-day operations. It never touched the actual land and building, because my mother had already moved those into an irrevocable trust more than a year earlier, quietly, with no announcement, no fanfare, and absolutely no way for Renee's lawyer to have caught it unless he'd pulled the full county record the way Diane had. Renee had sold a shell. She just didn't know it yet. Diane laid out our options carefully, the way she does everything. We could go straight to the police with the forgery, which was the fastest but the most explosive path, one that would blow the family apart publicly and immediately. We could file a civil suit to void the transfer deed, which would take months and put everything through the courts before a single thing was resolved. Or we could do what my mother, in her own quiet way, seemed to have been preparing me to do all along. We could let the deal move forward exactly as scheduled, all the way to the closing table, and let the trust documents do the talking at the one moment nobody could argue with paper. I chose the third option. I want to be honest with you about why. It wasn't mercy, not entirely. It was strategy. I wanted Renee standing in a room full of people, a title company, a developer's lawyer, our mother's caregiver, when she finally understood that everything she'd built on a forged signature was about to collapse in front of witnesses who couldn't be talked around the way family members can be talked around at a kitchen table. Over the next 3 weeks, I did something that felt strange and cold and necessary all at once. I said nothing to Renee. I let her keep believing the closing was going forward exactly as she'd planned it. I even let her send me one more cheerful group chat message about how relieved she was that this chapter was almost closed and we could all move forward as a family. I stared at that message for a long time before I put my phone face down and went back to the folder Diane and I had been building. Those 3 weeks were the strangest of my life. I went to work every day, ran Dune & Co. the way I always had, delivered a 5-tier cake to a wedding on a Saturday, with my hands perfectly steady, even though I'd spent the drive over rehearsing what I would say if Renee called and asked why I sounded strange. She never called. She was too busy, I later learned, meeting with the developer's representatives, picking out which of the bakery's old fixtures she planned to keep for herself before the demolition crew arrived. Priya asked me more than once during those weeks if I was doing the right thing by staying quiet. "Wouldn't it be kinder to just tell her now?" she said one night, both of us icing 3 dozen cupcakes for a Sunday brunch order, so she has time to back out before it gets worse for her? I thought about that for a long time before I answered. I told Priya that I had spent 31 years being the sister who gave people time, who assumed the best, who let things go because confrontation felt like it cost more than it was worth. I told her that this time, for once, I wanted the truth to arrive on paper, in a room full of professionals, where nobody could talk their way around it afterward. Priya didn't argue with me after that. She just handed me another piping bag and let me work. I visited the bakery twice during those 3 weeks, standing across the street with a coffee in my hand, watching Renee through the front window directing 2 men who were measuring the walls for something, a renovation plan she thought she'd never have to explain to anyone. I didn't go in. I wasn't ready yet, and some part of me wanted to save whatever I had to say for the room where it would actually matter. I also went to see my mother. This part I want to tell slowly, because it mattered to me more than almost anything else in this whole story. My mother was having what her caregiver called a clearer week. Not every day was clear anymore, but some were, and I got lucky. I found her in the sunroom of the house, a crossword puzzle open on her lap, reading glasses pushed up into her gray hair. I sat down across from her and I asked her, gently, if she remembered going to see Diane about the building. She looked at me for a long moment, the way she used to look at a batch of dough to check if it had risen enough. Then she said, quiet and certain, I remember I was scared. I remember I didn't want either of you to have to fight over what your grandfather built. I did what I could while I still knew how to do it. Did I do it right? She asked me, and there was something in her voice that broke my heart clean in half. A woman who had run a business for 40 years, suddenly unsure whether her last great act of protection had worked. You did it exactly right, Mom, I told her, and I meant every word. She reached over and patted my hand the way she used to when I was small, and had scraped a knee behind the counter. More comfort in the gesture than in anything she could have said. Then her eyes drifted, just slightly, toward the window, toward the direction of Ashford Street, though the bakery couldn't have been visible from that distance. Is your sister still angry at me for something? She asked, and the question landed strangely, because I didn't think she meant it about the trust at all. I think some far-off part of her simply remembered that things between us had gone wrong without remembering exactly why. I told her Renee wasn't angry at her, that none of this was her fault, and she nodded slowly, the way she used to nod at a customer's complaint she didn't fully agree with but wanted to make feel heard anyway. Before I left, she gripped my wrist with more strength than I expected and said one more thing that I've carried with me since. Whatever happens with the building, you make sure people still get their bread on time. That's the only part that was ever really the point. I promised her I would, and I have kept that promise every single day since. The closing was scheduled for a Tuesday morning at Ashford Title Services, 3 blocks from the bakery itself. I want to walk you through that room the way I walked into it, because every detail mattered. Renee arrived first, dressed the way she dressed for things she wanted to look important, a sharp gray blazer, her hair freshly done. She had her lawyer, Foster Kellerman, beside her, a thin man with a leather portfolio he kept opening and closing like he was nervous about something he couldn't name yet. The developer's representative, a brisk woman named Patricia Aldean, sat at the head of the table with the escrow officer, a careful, precise man named Robert Gans, who I would come to be deeply grateful for. I walked in with Diane at my side, carrying a folder of my own, and I remember consciously slowing my steps so I wouldn't look like I was rushing into anything. Renee's face did something complicated when she saw me. Surprise first, then a flicker of irritation, then something that looked almost like guilt, gone so fast I might have imagined it if I hadn't been watching for it. "Claire," she said, forcing a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "I didn't realize you'd want to be here for this. I figured you'd rather stay out of it, given everything." "Given everything," I repeated, keeping my voice pleasant. "That's an interesting way to put it. I wouldn't have missed this for the world, Renee," and I sat down across from her, folder squared in front of me, and folded my hands the way I'd practiced in the car on the drive over. Foster Kellerman gave me a professional nod that didn't quite disguise the small furrow of confusion on his brow. He clearly hadn't been told I'd be attending either, and I understood, watching him, that whatever plan Renee had built, it had never once accounted for me showing up in this particular room. Robert Gans began the way these meetings always begin, running through the paperwork in a flat, procedural voice, confirming names, confirming the parcel number, confirming the sale price. I let him get about halfway through before Diane raised her hand, polite but unmistakably firm. "Before we go further," she said, "I have documents relevant to this closing that I believe the title company needs to see." Renee's smile faltered. "What documents?" she asked, her voice climbing just slightly. "This isn't the time for family drama, Claire." "This isn't drama," I said. "It's paperwork. You'd appreciate that more than anyone." Diane laid 3 things on the table, one at a time, the way she'd laid them out for me weeks earlier in her office. First, the certified copy of the trust deed, recorded at the county clerk's office 14 months before any transfer deed existed. Second, the trust instrument itself, naming our mother as trustee while she had capacity, and naming me as successor trustee the moment she was declared unable to manage her own affairs, a declaration that had already been formally made by her physician 6 weeks earlier. Third, a forensic handwriting comparison Diane had quietly commissioned, laying my actual signature from a dozen documents beside the signature on the forged transfer deed. Even to an untrained eye, the difference was plain. The hook on the C, the slant of the D, small things, unmistakable things. Robert Gans picked up the trust deed first. He read it slowly, the way careful people read things that are about to change everything. Then he looked at the parcel number on the sale agreement in front of him and compared it to the parcel number on the trust deed. They were the same parcel. "Miss Doone," he said, looking at Renee now, "not me. This property was transferred into an irrevocable trust over a year ago. This title company cannot close a sale on real estate that isn't held by the seller of record. The bakery's business entity may have changed hands, but the land and the building underneath it were never yours to sell." The room went very quiet. I watched Foster Kellerman's hand freeze halfway through opening his portfolio, his eyes moving from the trust deed to the parcel number on his own paperwork and back again, doing math he clearly hadn't expected to have to do out loud in front of clients. Renee's voice, when it came, was sharp and too loud for the small room. "That's impossible. I have the deed. I have Claire's signature right here." She yanked her own copy from Foster's portfolio and slapped it flat on the table, jabbing a finger at the signature line as though sheer force could make it more true. "That signature isn't mine," I said, as calmly as I could manage. "I never signed that deed. I never saw it until a courier delivered a letter to my house telling me I no longer owned half of something I built my entire life around." Renee's face went through several colors in quick succession. "You're lying," she said, but her voice had already lost its certainty, the way voices do when the person speaking has started doing the math in their own head and doesn't like the answer. "I'm not the one who forged a signature, Renee," I said, "and I want you to understand that I did not raise my voice when I said it. I had promised myself I wouldn't. I have every bank statement, every discrepancy going back 18 months. I have Diane's notes from the meeting where Mom set up this trust because she was afraid of exactly what you did." Patricia Aldean, the developer's representative, closed her own folder with a soft, final click. "On behalf of my client," she said, "we're withdrawing from this transaction pending resolution of the ownership dispute." She stood, gathered her things, and left without another word, the particular quiet exit of someone who has just watched a deal collapse and wants no further part of the mess left behind. Foster Kellerman leaned toward Renee and said something low I couldn't hear, and whatever he said made her face go pale in a way I had genuinely never seen on my sister before, not once in 31 years. "I want you to know," Diane said, her voice even and professional, "that we are also filing a formal complaint regarding the forged transfer deed, and given that Mrs. Doone's diagnosed condition and the timeline of her power of attorney overlap significantly with this fraudulent transfer, we will be requesting that the court review the validity of that power of attorney as well." Renee stood up so fast her chair scraped hard against the floor. "This is insane," she said. "I have been taking care of Mom for a year. I moved into that house. I gave up my own life for her, and this is what I get." "You gave up your own life," I said quietly, "and then you tried to sell the thing she spent hers building." Nobody said anything after that. Robert Gans slid the paperwork back into a folder and said, very simply, "This closing is void." Then he stood, shook Diane's hand, and walked out to make whatever calls a title officer has to make when a fraud walks straight into his conference room. I want to tell you what happened after that room emptied out, because the aftermath mattered just as much as the confrontation itself. Renee followed me out to the parking lot that morning, her heels clicking fast against the pavement, and grabbed my arm before I could reach my car. "You did this on purpose," she said. "You let it get all the way to the closing table. You could have called me the second you found out." I turned to look at her, and for the first time in years, I didn't feel the old reflex to soften the moment, to smooth it over for her comfort the way I had my whole life. "You forged my name on a legal document, Renee," I said. "You didn't call me either, before you did that." She had no answer for that. She let go of my arm and stood in the parking lot while I got in my car and drove away, and in the rearview mirror I watched her get smaller, still standing exactly where I'd left her. Renee did not go quietly after that day, not for a long while. Over the following weeks, she called cousins, aunts, an old family friend who ran the church bake sale committee, telling anyone who would listen that I was trying to destroy the family, that I was jealous, that I had abandoned the bakery years ago and had no right to come back now and take it out from under her. Some people believed her for a while. Small towns work that way, and Renee has always been a better performer than I am. But paperwork, once it becomes part of a formal record, has a way of outlasting gossip. One by one, the people she'd called stopped repeating her version of events, especially after the forgery charge became public record, and the details of the timeline, the out-of-town lawyer, the miscellaneous withdrawals, started making the rounds instead. Adult Protective Services opened a formal investigation into the power of attorney within a month, after Diane filed a report documenting the timeline. The unfamiliar out-of-town lawyer Renee had chosen instead of our longtime family attorney, and the financial discrepancies I'd flagged and been brushed off about the previous spring. A forensic accountant Diane brought in traced $11,000 in bakery funds that had quietly moved into an account with Renee's name alone on it over the previous year. Money labeled in the books as miscellaneous expenses, vendor overpayments, small amounts, individually easy to miss, cumulatively impossible to explain. The forgery case took 9 months to work through the courts. Renee's lawyer, Foster Kellerman, withdrew from representing her 3 weeks after that closing, which told me almost everything I needed to know about how solid he'd believed his own paperwork to be. I never learned exactly what he'd known and when he'd known it, though Diane suspected he'd simply trusted the notarized deed Renee handed him without asking too many questions, the kind of professional shortcut that ends careers when it goes wrong in front of a title officer. In the end, Renee accepted a plea agreement rather than risk a trial, a felony forgery charge reduced to a lesser offense in exchange for restitution and probation, but a felony record all the same, the kind that follows a person the rest of their life whenever a background check gets run. I sat 2 rows behind her at the hearing where she entered her plea. She didn't turn around once. I didn't expect her to. The $11,000 the forensic accountant traced was ordered repaid to the bakery's accounts over 18 months. I still get a check in the mail on the first of most months. Small amounts, never quite on schedule. A slow trickle of restitution that feels less like justice and more like a reminder of everything that happened, arriving in my mailbox again and again long after I'd hoped to stop thinking about it. She moved out of my mother's house that spring. I don't know exactly where she lives now. I know she is no longer welcome in it, not because I decided that, but because the court, reviewing the power of attorney, formally revoked her authority and named me as the successor trustee already established in my mother's own trust, as my mother's legal guardian for financial matters going forward. I want to tell you about my mother now, because she deserves the ending of this story more than anyone. She still has good days and difficult ones. Some mornings she calls me by my name right away, sharp and clear, and asks whether the ovens at the bakery are running hot again the way they always did in summer. Some mornings she is somewhere further away, and I sit with her anyway, because that's what you do. Her caregiver, a patient woman named Odessa who has been with her since the diagnosis, tells me the good mornings have become a little more frequent lately, though I'm not sure if that's medically true or just something we've both decided to believe because it makes the difficult mornings easier to carry. The bakery sat closed for 4 months while the legal proceedings worked themselves out, the display case empty, the ovens cold for the first time in decades except for Christmas and my father's funeral. I used to drive past it some evenings on my way home from Dune & Co., just to look at the dark windows, and I'll admit there were nights I sat in my car outside that building and let myself cry in a way I hadn't allowed myself to in Diane's office or at the closing table, because there was no one there to see it, and because a building going quiet after 40 years felt like its own kind of grief, separate from everything Renee had done. The land and the building were never for sale, because my mother made sure of that a year before anyone else even knew there was a fight coming. Once the court formally revoked Renee's power of attorney and confirmed me as guardian of my mother's financial affairs, I reopened Sweetwater Bakery under a joint operation with my own catering company, the ovens running again 6 days a week, my mother's original recipes still taped inside the cabinet doors in her looping handwriting, flour-dusted, decades old, exactly where she left them. I kept the same hours she always kept. I kept the same closed sign in the window on Christmas. Some things, I decided, didn't need to change just because everything around them had. The first morning I unlocked the front door again. A few of the old regulars were already waiting outside. An elderly man named Mr. Averill, who'd bought the same cinnamon roll every Saturday for as long as I could remember, a woman from the church choir who used to bring my mother tomatoes from her garden every August. They didn't ask me any questions about what had happened. They just said it was good to see the lights back on, and I understood, standing behind that counter again with flour on my hands for the first time in months, exactly what my mother had meant all those years ago about the 2 kinds of flour on the shelf. Last month I baked her a cake, vanilla, the way she always made it for the shop's anniversary. I brought it to the sunroom and set it on the table beside her crossword puzzle. "Whose birthday is it?" she asked, looking at the candle. "Nobody's," I told her. "It's just Tuesday. We're allowed to have cake on a Tuesday." She smiled at that, the real smile, the one I still recognize even on the hardest days. "Your grandfather would have liked that," she said. "He never did understand why people waited for occasions." Priya asked me once, months after everything had settled, whether I ever felt guilty about how it had all played out, about letting the closing move forward instead of stopping it the moment I found out. I thought about that question for a long time before I answered her, the way I think most honest answers deserve to be thought about rather than handed over quickly. I told her I didn't feel guilty, but I did feel something adjacent to it, a kind of tiredness that comes from realizing you had to become a different version of yourself just to survive being the reliable one for 31 years. I told her that for most of my life, being the good daughter meant absorbing things quietly, believing the best about people who hadn't earned it, and that the version of me who sat calmly at that closing table with a folder of evidence was not a colder person than the one who used to swallow her own unease at a kitchen table. She was just a version of me who had finally run out of reasons to keep doing that. There is one more conversation I want to tell you about, because it changed how I understood my sister, even after everything. About 6 months after the plea agreement, Renee called me. I almost didn't pick up. When I did, her voice was smaller than I'd ever heard it. None of the sharpness from the closing table, none of the certainty she'd always used like armor. "I'm not calling to ask for anything," she said, before I could say a word. "I just wanted to say that I know what I did was wrong. I told myself for a long time that I deserved a bigger share because I was the one who moved back in, the one who gave up my life to take care of her. But I didn't earn that by forging your name. I earned it, if I earned anything, by actually showing up, and I stopped doing that the second I started thinking about the money instead of her. I didn't forgive her on that call. I want to be honest about that, because I think stories like this one sometimes rush toward forgiveness faster than real life ever does. I told her I appreciated her saying it, and I told her I hoped she meant it, and I told her that whatever came next between us would take a lot longer than one phone call to rebuild, if it could be rebuilt at all. She said she understood. We haven't spoken much since a birthday text here, a brief exchange at a cousin's wedding there, careful and polite, the way 2 people are with each other after something has broken that neither one is sure can be fixed. Maybe someday it will be different. I'm not in a hurry to find out. I think about that irrevocable trust often, the quiet, deliberate thing my mother did alone, a year before anyone knew she needed to. I think about how she never once accused Renee out loud, never confronted anyone, never raised her voice. She just went to see the one person she trusted completely and put the truth in writing where it would still speak for her long after her own words started slipping away. There is a particular kind of love in that, I think, the kind that doesn't announce itself, that does the hard, unglamorous work of protecting someone years before that person even knows they'll need protecting. Here's what I want you to take from this, if you take anything at all. A signature can be forged. A story can be twisted around a kitchen table until it sounds almost believable. But paper, real paper, filed and recorded and witnessed, does not change no matter how many times someone tells a different version of events. Sometimes the people who love us most aren't the ones who fight loudest in the moment. They're the ones who quietly make sure that when the fight finally comes, you're already standing on solid ground. That's my story. If someone in your life has ever tried to take something you built by writing your name where it didn't belong, I hope you find your own version of that trust deed, whatever form it takes. And if this reminded you to check in on an aging parent, to ask the quiet questions before you need the answers, do that today. Thank you for listening.